The following program is underwritten by the Nevada Irrigation District. Since 1921, providing clean and healthy drinking and irrigation water to more than 24,000 homes, farms, schools, and businesses in Nevada and Placer counties.
Hi, I'm your host, Lou Sitzer. This is NCTV Interviews, and today we really have quite a special program. This is our first hour-long interview, and it's really the culmination of a few years of work looking at the poets, authors, artists in our community. Today we have Gary Snyder, not only nationally known, but internationally recognized Pulitzer Prize winner, author of 18 books in print and 6 or 7 out of print.
That's my guess.
Yeah, and many of the books right here, I've really followed as much as I could Gary's work while I've been here since 1971, and Gary came here about 1970.
Right, just the year before you.
Right, so it's been great talking with Gary in preparation for the show. And so for those of you who aren't really aware of Gary's work or life, we wanted to go into some of the early childhood, not too early, but the idea that you grew up in the Northwest in Washington in a farming family. Would you describe that for us?
During the Depression years, my father, who had been born in the Pacific Northwest, and my mother, who had moved up there when she was 12 from Texas, managed to settle on a few acres of land outside the city, Seattle, to the north, and in what we call stumpland. Started a little dairy farm, chickens, a small orchard, vegetable garden, and that's what I grew up working on, with a mile walk down to the local grade school near the town of what is now known as Lake City. So that was a good Depression era, hardworking, simple life that my sister and I actually grew to love.
Mm-hmm. And that is something that has been a theme throughout your life, that you've maintained a sense of connection with the woods, the wild, the Northwest, the mountains.
I never stopped having curiosity and questions about it. I'm not sure why that should be the case, but early on I started exploring the forest that was nearby, camping and sleeping in it overnight sometimes, even when I was 8 or 9 years old. And then I fell in with people who took me fishing, and later people who took me backpacking up in the high country, in the Olympics and the Cascades. And by the time I was 15, I'd started snow peak mountaineering in the Northwest.
What kind of mountaineering?
Snow peak.
Snow peak.
You know, like Mount Hood, Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, Mount Jefferson.
So you had this desire to climb the peaks.
Well, when I saw them, yes. Once I saw them, I thought, that's a good place to go.
And so how did this experience, childhood experience, lead you to sort of develop poetry as a profession?
Well, poetry as a profession is an accident, but I grew up delighting in language, and I was luckily able to read from an early age, and so I read widely while also working and exploring around. And poetry seemed to me to be one of the things that was perfectly natural. It's what people do with, one of the things people do with language, not exotic, not esoteric. I've always felt that, and I guess my mother, who was quite a literate person, enforced that for me. So it was one of the many choices, that one of the many interests that I had that I was able to follow up on. And language is a wonderful, mysterious thing that we are all born with, and we use it all our lives without much considering it and how it works. And I'm one of those people who really wanted to understand how and why language gets the way it is. So maybe that's part of what might lead one to poetry. I first started writing poetry after I did mountaineering, snow peak mountaineering. I couldn't find another language to describe what it was like to be up that high and how it felt early in the morning, before dawn, cold, the tinkle of glacier ice falling behind you as you chop steps. It's a wonderful sensation. So I started writing poetry from mountaineering rather than from failed love affairs, which is where most poetry starts. I came to that later.
But you're right when I think about the times that I've been up in the mountains, and it is a very quieting, thoughtful experience, which leads one to want to write things down.
Well, it gives you another perspective on space and on time, and seeing all of those vast forests up there also gave me a sense of what North America really was like, what it had been like, and also I could see the clear cuts coming in, and the spread of the city, and somehow I ended up sort of taking the side of nature, as I have done ever since, and including the situation of the natural world in my moral compass, wanting to be as much a spokesperson for the natural world as for the human world.
And so from a childhood in the Northwest, you worked in the forestry, in the Forest Service?
Oh, that came later.
Came later?
Yeah, I was working on the farm when I was younger, milking cows, shoveling the stuff. I got good at it. And then, gosh, when I was in my mid-teens, well, as soon as I was able to, 18, I went to work as a summertime Forest Service backcountry laborer, trail crew, and sometimes firefighting. Gifford Pinchot National Forest, and then later the Mount Baker National Forest. And then in between, I started going some seasons to logging on the east side of the mountains with the Warm Springs Lumber Company over in eastern Oregon. So I was out there both with the Forest Service and with the timber industry.
And then you decided to leave for Japan.
Well, oh gosh, I have to tell you a complicated story.
Well, I'm not sure we have all that much time.
No, well, my interest in nature led me to an interest in the Far East, partly from having seen those wonderful East Asian landscape paintings of mountains and streams. And after going through several years of study of North American Indian linguistics, graduate school in Indiana, I came back to graduate school in Berkeley to study classical Chinese and Japanese with the intention of somehow getting to Japan to find out more about East Asia. And that got me to Japan, sure enough. Yeah.
And you spent a considerable amount of time there.
I had a domicile in Kyoto, Japan for 12 years. I was out to India for 6 months one time. I was back on the West Coast for a year another time. But that was where my home was for 12 years.
And you, from what I remember, you became a monk?
I became what you might call, we don't have these categories in the West, a kind of a lay monk in the Zen school of Buddhism. And I lived in Buddhist temples for a couple of years, and I studied and worked in another Zen monastery for a number of years with a Zen teacher. And I got to be pretty good at Japanese.
And that experience has pretty much carried you throughout in terms of your interest and involvement with Buddhism since.
Oh, well, I'm a Buddhist. What can I say? I became a Buddhist in my own mind before I ever went to Asia. Mm-hmm. You know what made me into a Buddhist first? Discovering that Buddhist ethics include non-human beings as well as human beings. You know, thou shalt not kill only applies to human beings. Mm. The Buddhist precept says, don't hurt anything if you can help it. Doesn't matter how big or little. And I thought, that sounds better to me. Mm-hmm. It fit my sensibility. And so that is part of my, evolving environmental conscience. But Buddhism has also a powerful psychological and spiritual training and elegant philosophy that is intellectually very demanding. So I fell for all of that.
So, I'm wanting to move into your poetry, but I want to get to some items before that, and that is, you came back from Japan.
Yeah.
You transitioned to a completely different society. You moved to the Ridge and
right.
decided to take up residence off the grid mm-hmm. in a sort of a Japanese way.
Well, I learned a few good things in Japan, and not just from Buddhist temples, but from Japanese farmers and Japanese fishermen, ordinary people. I did learn tricks and tools that added onto my Forest Service background. I was grateful for that. But my thinking about moving back to the land, as we used to call it, in 1970, was not fueled by some kind of romantic escapism. It had always been my assumption that eventually I would want to live more or less the way it was when I grew up. I was a country boy, mm-hmm. and so I felt perfectly at home settling in where we were, off the grid as it happened. And many of the carpentry tools and small-scale woodcutting and logging tools that I have came through my father, and some go back to my grandfather. Mm.
Well, and we're looking now at your home and your dog, and seeing that living off the grid doesn't necessarily mean living without. And actually, it has the advantage of being in touch with so many different things. Here are solar collectors, which enable you to have computer and other amenities that you've found to be useful.
20 years after burning kerosene lamps and Aladdin lamps, that was our light for 20 years, mm-hmm. Then I decided to get solar panels. I'm very conservative, very slow to move on these things. But when I did, I decided it was a good thing. And so I'm very happy to have those now. And of course, that enables us to have computers. And we even have a dish, to download the internet. And it all runs on solar.
Well, that really contrasts a lot with my own experience, which was living in a city throughout my early life, and then discovering this part of the Back to the Land movement, which enabled me to leave Southern California and take up something somewhat a similar life, not parallel, well, parallel, but not exactly. And so having come up to this county and in 1971, I just found that that it was an important part to connect to nature, and it's an experience that a lot of people in cities don't have.
It's true. There is more nature in the city than people think, and I have urban bioregionalist friends like Peter Berg, who leads fish walks, bird walks, and insect walks in downtown San Francisco. And
That's
to
great.
point out how much is actually there.
That's great.
Also, San Francisco is right on the Pacific Coast Flyway, and it's right where the hawks come over when they're migrating. So you can count hawks going by from a lot of high points around right in the city of San Francisco. There are people who know that. You know, I really am happy about the development of an interest, curiosity, and knowledge about the natural world that's taking place society-wide now, whether you're in the city or in the country. You do not have to be out in the country to do this.
Well, that's good to know, because it's a time where we do need to renew our connections.
It is.
Yeah.
And of course, if you're going to live in the country, out in the rural areas, out in the semi-forested, semi-wilderness, you have to take on your local issues. And our local issues are, in part, proper forest management, long-term forest health, forest ecology and ecological systems in general, and the threat of wildfire and the history of wildfire. So, you know, I consider those sort of backyard or front door issues that I must deal with because they're in my world, as well as, you know, larger global issues.
And we're going to be, you know, talking and hearing more of that. But I was thinking about the first time I actually heard you read was really for me an altering experience, and I thought maybe you could read something at this point. I was thinking of Song of the Taste, because as I told Gary earlier, we were so taken with this one poem that we created season greetings cards with this poem that we sent to friends at that time in 1971.
I'll read it if I can find it. You have what page it's on?
Yeah, I do. It's right here if you want to take from my
Oh,
book.
okay. This poem called Song of the Taste was written in Kyoto, Japan, after I'd been there maybe 3 or 4 years living in Japan. And on the side, beside, as well as, you know, language and history books, I was reading some English language books on ecology and biology, scientific ecology, and getting deeper into it, so that at one point it occurred to me that one could say that the study of ecology was the study of energy transformations, meaning things eating each other. And it led me to a reflection on, well, what is it that we are eating? So then I wrote down this poem called Song of the Taste, which is still really one of my favorites. Song of the Taste. Eating the living germs of grasses, rice and wheat. Eating the ova of large birds. The fleshy sweetness packed around the sperm of swaying trees, apples. The muscles of the flanks and thighs of soft-voiced cows. The bounce in the lamb's leap. The swish in the ox's tail. Eating roots grown swole inside the soil. Drawing on life of living. Clustered points of light spun out of space, hidden in the grape. Eating each other's seed, eating, each other. Kissing the lover in the mouth of bread, lip to lip.
What I love about poetry, and this illustrates it, is sort of going beyond the word and dealing with combinations that would not be on our ordinary speech pattern, bringing up images that are innovative.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what poetry is hopefully is going to do. And as Basho, the great haiku poet, said, speaking of those little tiny poems, he said, the words stop, but the meaning keeps going on.
Right. So a lot of your life has been in the forest, and a lot of your study has been how people have dealt with forest and the history of forests. So in moving to your place, in particular, what did you need to do to become to become safe?
Safe?
Well, maybe that's the wrong word. What I meant was to be secure when fire is present.
Oh, talking about fire. I didn't become safe for a long time. I'm not safe now. One of the things you do is recognize the danger and the impermanence of all things with a calm mind. That helps. Another is to be somewhat prepared. And so having done some forest fire fighting in the Northwest, I had my own duff hoe, which is called a McLeod in California. Pulaski's, axes, saws, chainsaws later on. Equipped ourselves with backpack pumps. For a while, a lot of us had two-way radios when there were no telephone lines out there. Radios in the trucks and radios in the house, or mobiles. We had actually a community firefighting team way out on the margins in areas where the great, the wonderful North San Juan Ridge Volunteer Fire Department can't always get there right away. But the other thing you do, of course, is clear out the underbrush and limb up the trees, get the fire ladder out, pile up your brush, and in those days we always burned the brush piles. So over 37, 38 years, I've managed to push the brush and the fire ladders back quite a few hundred feet from the house itself. And yet, it looks good. It looks wild.
I was just out this morning clearing. I've got piles of manzanita that I've cut, trying to keep things down because, as you know, and we all know living in this area, fire creates, a dangerous situation, particularly now that the forests have so overgrown.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks to the great energy of the government in suppressing all fires, which they are always going to do, suppress all fires of whatever sort, Also, we've been burning firewood for 37 years for a lot of cooking and almost all of the heating. And that eats back at the buildup on the forest floor. It's wonderful living this way. And I've never had any hesitation about going about it, but I realize that people who have come here recently, newcomers, who are taking delight in their little wild plot of land, are very sensitive about cutting or trimming anything back. I can respect that. So it helps to know that thickness and density of vegetation doesn't necessarily represent a natural state. It represents a state that has come about from the absence of fire over the last 100 years. Because as the Sierra Nevada is described, it is a fire-adapted ecology within which low-level fires should be going through every 25 or 30 years. And if that was the pattern before white people came out here and started changing the direction of the woods.
You have a poem that addresses that.
Is that the control burn?
Control burn.
Shall I read that?
Please.
Oh, yeah. I know where that is.
Okay.
219. This was written the second or third year that I was living up here, too. 1971 or 1972.
I think it might be.
Here it is.
Yeah, great.
What we called a control burn, what everybody called a control burn back then, is now more accurately called a prescribed burn. And it means a forest fire of relatively small dimension started deliberately for the purpose of helping the forest return more to its natural and original state, but keeping it in a scale and under conditions that will keep it from getting out of control. Still, prescribed burns sometimes get out of control, and we shouldn't let that bother us too much, unless it happens to be your house. Now, what the Indians here used to do was to burn out the brush every year in the woods, up the gorges, keeping the oak and the pine stands tall and clear, with grasses and kit dizzy under them, but never enough fuel there that a fire could crown. Now, manzanita, a fine bush in its own right, crowds up under the new trees, mixed up with logging slash, and a fire can wipe out all. Fire is an old story, I would like, with a sense of helpful order, with respect for laws of nature, to help my land with a burn, a hot, clean burn. Manzanita seeds will only open after a fire passes over, or once passed through a bear, and then it would be more like when it belonged to the Indians before. So I have neighbors who are doing prescribed burns every year or so, with the cooperation of the BLM, the Forest Service, Volunteer Fire Department.
Well, I know that the Forestry Service is very concerned as we move into summer and not having had a lot of rainfall, trees being stressed, that there will be great fire danger. And so moving toward a safer, defensible space is what it's referred to.
Right.
It should be a concern of all of us. And somehow, I think the forests will benefit as well, as you say. I mean, as I'm cutting manzanita, I realize that this is a good thing.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be the whole forest.
Right. No.
Although, if we were looking way ahead, it would be ideal to eventually bring at least some of the Sierra Nevada forests back to that pre-contact state of relative openness, quite a few large, big, fireproof trees, and then some smaller trees, all age mixed together, but with periodic low-level fires, keeping undergrowth buildup from presenting a big hazard. Given enough time and persistence, maybe that could be brought about. Or on the other hand, one of these days, we may just get a huge forest fire that goes up and down the Sierra Nevada.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've had signs of that in the past, the 49er fire probably being the most recent one.
Right.
And really it was remarkable how our community did rally together and work, much as the Ridge would work if there were a fire. Yeah, well, they learned a lot from that, I think. I think it was after the 49er fire that every summer I take about 10 or a dozen archive boxes of my most valuable and important papers with red stickers on them and stack them neatly in a cube near the door of the barn. That's what goes in the back of the truck if we have to evacuate. I always have it ready to go. Includes my passport. So I wanted to come back to some points that you make throughout your writings, and that is when we first came here, my wife and I, and started a family, there was this notion of being of the place, people of the place, having essentially roots, staying long enough, not being transient as we move around in this world, and sinking roots and becoming more integrated. And I was just wondering, it seems that that has been an important theme as part of your writings.
It has, yeah. And as part of my own self-education, too, the idea of place, the importance of place, and how one goes about realizing, so to speak, where you are. It is possible to have been physically resident somewhere for decades and still know nothing about it. And that may be part of the problem with American settlement in much of this continent. People were moving in too fast to take time to learn about it. What I think of when I think of learning about the place is annual rainfall, which establishes a lot for the vegetation. What is the vegetation zone? What differences are there with altitude? These are things anybody growing flowers or vegetables would also want to learn. What is the lay of the land? Where are the major creeks and rivers? What are they doing? And here's a really interesting question. What was the original vegetation here before the contemporary world went to work on it? Original vegetation is kind of a baseline. It's a database for what that landscape will do on its own account. We have a tremendous amount of original vegetation right here now that we can look at. There's also a lot of introduced trees around. If you keep your eyes out for them, you'll see them, like the locust trees. And of course, much more introduced plant life down in the valley. And then understanding California, first step is to know that it is what is called a summer dry, winter wet climate. And that it has a 6-month drought, and then it has a 6-month rainy spell. Many places in the world, most places in the world, do not have a climate like that. That's called a Mediterranean climate. So it sets a certain type of tree and shrub going, and it makes for specific adaptations on all levels. And that just helps you tune yourself into what might be going on where you are. And then also, if you know original vegetation, you can appreciate what might have been drastically done to alter things and be in a position to judge if those changes are healthy or not so healthy. This is true actually for the whole world, and much more so for Europe. I was in Spain a few years ago and spent some time in the marvelous old city of Barcelona. One of the first things I learned about Barcelona was that it was started as a colony first by the Carthaginians. The Romans came quite a bit later. So I asked some of those wonderful Barcelona anarchist intellectuals, in Catalonia they still have anarchists who frankly and gladly tell you they're anarchists. So I asked them, well, what do you think the original vegetation here was? And one of them said to me, oh, we don't think there ever was an original vegetation here. I don't think he even knew what the term meant. But it was the Carthaginians who first logged the area around Carthage. The Romans did a backup job after the 1st century BC. So a lot of Europe has been so radically transformed that and China even more so, that it's like a detective search to figure out what was growing there 4,000 years ago. And yet it helps a lot to know that. So this is just one of the little territories that I think are worth investigating. I think we can also learn a great deal from knowing how indigenous people lived in the landscape. What did they use for medicine, for food, for fiber, for soap, for dyes, for making bags and baskets? All of that tells you some very important things about the place.
And we also have Native Plant Society.
The California Native Plant Society.
If people are concerned and want to find out more, they can attend Plant Society meetings.
Well, the Red Bud chapter of the California Native Plant Society is based here in Nevada County, and they have field trips this spring every weekend, virtually every weekend. They have a wonderful magazine called Fremontia. I must confess, I'm a native plant fanatic, and I have subscribed to Fremontia from the first issue about 25 years ago.
Well, in that vein, I wanted to tackle sustainability. What is sustainability? Because it's something that we hear about and yet don't really know.
Yeah, and it's become such a buzzword. And it's become, you know, like the word green. You can attach it to anything and make it seem better without necessarily having to be too critical about it. Or, you know, people calling this or that kind of food natural.
Right.
When the truth is, in the physical universe, by definition, there's nothing that's not natural. That's another way of defining nature, scientific way of defining nature.
I'm sure the food companies like that definition.
Oh yeah, it makes it really easy for them. But sustainability, for me, has to be ultimately based on the question of long-term available energy and no net loss of biodiversity.
And so explain biodiversity.
Well, biodiversity means species as well as individuals. It means species and the habitats in which they live of animals, birds, insects, and plants. The planet, over millions of years, has evolved a marvelous array of beings that are remarkably adapted and interacting incredibly with each other, which is indeed the sustainable power of the natural world, planet Earth and its ecology. Boy, what a story. And you know, this TV program that's running right now on the Discovery Channel called Planet Earth, outstanding, remarkable photography. 11 series, 11 programs altogether. I think they've done about 3 already. Pick it up, get it, get the DVD. It is not preaching environmentalism. It doesn't have to. It just shows people, and most of us have never seen a lot of these things, what's going on the planet.
And that's really coming into play much more so as we hear about global warming,
Right.
climate change,
Right.
and and how it's all going to affect us. We're becoming much more aware of the connectivity of everything.
Yeah, it's time, yeah. So sustainability in terms of forests, let us take that for an example, would mean, in my understanding, sustainable forest management would be something that does not depend on outside energy inputs. That is to say, a fertilized and artificially irrigated forest plantation is not sustainable because the energy sources might dry up. The criterion of biodiversity means your forest, from which you will be taking timber for fiber and lumber, will not lose any of its species, including spotted owls, and hopefully we can bring the fisher back, which is a larger predatory mammal of the weasel family, which is now considered extinct in the Sierra Nevada, or virtually extinct. And all of the other species that were there should be there.
I think one of the fears that people have is the idea of biodiversity sounds great, but do we really have to give up what we've got in order to reach this kind of equilibrium?
What have we got? Not for forest sustainability, no. You might have to pay a slightly higher price for lumber. So what? You might have to pay a higher price for food too if we start having better food. We'll all pay higher prices for all of those things as the price of oil goes up. It's inevitable. So yeah, there are readjustments that everyone has to make there. And maybe you want to grow more of your vegetables at home. Maybe you'll want to go back and burn a little more firewood for heat in the winter. And maybe we might want to walk or ride a bicycle more. And maybe we might want to have a better and more often used network of public transportation. It just makes me sick at heart every time I see these buses, the county buses, going out this way and out that way with only 3 or 4 people on them. You know, they're only doing that because the federal government is underwriting it, hoping that people will begin to get back into using public transportation. There are a few people from way out on San Juan Ridge who catch the morning bus from clear out at North Columbia Schoolhouse, ride it all the way into town, do their shopping, catch the last bus going back out there at 5 or 6 p.m. That's the way to live in the third world.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, who cares? Pretty soon we're going to be in the third world, all of us.
Well, before we get there, let's enjoy the rest of the program. You received the...
Well, I already checked out how much electricity it takes to run this. We can run it.
Good. All right. We'll just keep our lumber supply constant. You received the Pulitzer Prize in 1975, Turtle Island.
Right.
Was this a surprise?
It was, yeah. At that time, I was so involved living here and taking care of the place, and lots of work still going on, that I wasn't thinking about the East Coast at all and what goes on in the literary world there. But my book, Turtle Island, which was published by an East Coast publisher, New Directions, it had a lot of environmental thinking woven into the poems. And the term Turtle Island is a Native American word for the continent of North America. And it's still being used in a lot of places. And I liked it because it puts North America in another context. If you say the United States, you're talking about something that is a little over 200 years old. If you say America, you're talking about something that is 500 years old. If you say Turtle Island, you're talking hundreds of millions of years. And that helps us get a sense of where we are. As it happens, the committee for the Pulitzer Prize gave it the Pulitzer Prize, and a neighbor hiked into my place to tell me. I didn't have a radio even then, let alone a phone.
And since, have you found that award plus many others, has it changed your life appreciably?
People ask this question,
Yeah.
and I have to be honest. I didn't think it would change my life, but it does. In American society, anything that gives you a little edge in credibility goes a long ways.
Yeah.
I understand that now. I didn't understand that then. Whether or not I deserved the Pulitzer Prize that year, or any year, nonetheless, if some organization or institution, some university is putting together their winter program of lecturers and speakers, and they've got a list of names, and then they say, well, this guy won the Pulitzer Prize, well, let's get him. Mm. So it's had that kind of benign effect. And it's made it just a little easier for me to make a living over the years, I'm sure.
Well, I'd like to move to a poem that you wrote, and I think this, it was prior to the publishing of Turtle Island.
Yeah.
It's Smokey the Bear Sutra.
Yeah, quite a bit prior. Well, 5 years prior.
But it was written in the 60s, or maybe right around 1970?
I started thinking toward it probably in the mid-60s when I was studying what is known as the circumpolar bear cult and the history of bear archaeology and bear finds in Europe, Germany, Spain, France, where they have caves that were occupied by bears 70, 80,000 years ago that they know of now. I was thinking about that. And then, of course, I knew about the Forest Service and its Smokey the Bear story. And gradually, and then I knew some stories from Buddhist mythology about mountain deities and figures who were unafraid of fire. And so it all sort of came together once I was back here in the United States in San Francisco in February of 1969.
And considering that it was written almost 50 years ago, it looks at the world as we see it now.
Afraid so.
Would you mind reading it?
Okay. I don't know if this really should be called a poem or what. I titled it the Smokey the Bear Sutra. The sutra is a Buddhist text. It's a Buddhist presentation, supposedly delivered to all kinds of beings, whoever is there, whoever will listen, on the nature of the truth. And there are many sutras. So I wrote this thinking of it as a sutra, a teaching text delivered to human beings by a bear. And I told myself, and I still tell people, just for fun, the Forest Service never realized what it was doing when it took this little cub that it found and made it into an icon. The icon belonged to a much greater and more archaic tradition than they ever imagined. And so its power is now beginning to be shown. Smokey the Bear. Well, no, that isn't where it began. Here's where it begins. Smokey the Bear Sutra. Once in the Jurassic era, about 150 million years ago, the great sun, Buddha, in this corner of the infinite void, gave a discourse to all the assembled elements and the energies, to the standing beings, the walking beings, the flying beings, and the sitting beings, even grasses, to the number of 13 billion, each one born from a seed, assembled before him, a discourse concerning enlightenment on planet Earth. He said, in some far future time, there will be a continent called America. It will have centers of power like Pyramid Lake, Walden Pond, Mount Rainier, Big Sur, Everglades, and so forth, and powerful nerves and channels like the Columbia River, the Mississippi River, the Grand Canyon. The human race in that era will get into troubles all over its head and practically wreck everything in spite of its own strong, intelligent Buddha nature. He said, the twisting strata of the mountains and the pulsings of volcanoes are my love burning deep in the earth. My obstinate compassion is schist and basalt and granite to be mountains to bring down the rain. In that future American era, I shall enter a new form to save the world from loveless knowledge that seeks with blind hunger and mindless rage eating food that will not fill it. And he then showed himself in his true form of Smokey the Bear. A handsome, smoky-colored brown bear standing on his hind legs, which shows that he is aroused and watchful, bearing in his right paw the shovel that digs to the truth beneath appearances, cuts the ruts of useless attachments, and flings damp sand on the fires of greed and war. And his left paw in the mudra of comradely display, indicating that all creatures have the full right to live to their limits, and that deer, rabbits, chipmunks, snakes, dandelions, and lizards all grow in the realm of the Dharma. Wearing the blue work overalls, symbolic of slaves and laborers, the countless people oppressed by a civilization that claims to save but often destroys. Wearing the broad-brimmed hat of the West, symbolic of the forces that guard the wilderness, which is the natural state of things and the true path of people on earth, and all true paths do lead through mountains. With a halo of smoke and flame behind him, forest fires of the Kali Yuga, end of the universe, fires caused by the stupidity of those who think things can be gained and lost, where in truth all is contained, vast and free, in the blue sky and green earth of one great mind. Round-bellied, to show his kind nature, and that the great earth has food enough for everyone who loves her and trusts her. Trampling underfoot wasteful freeways and needless suburbs, smashing the worms of capitalism and totalitarianism, indicating the task. His followers becoming free of cars, canned food, universities, and shoes, master the three mysteries of their own body, speech, and mind, and then fearlessly chop down the rotten trees and prune out the sick limbs of this country, America, and then burn the leftover trash. Wrathful but calm, austere but comic, Smokey the Bear will illuminate those who would help him, but for those who would hinder or slander him, he will put them out. Thus, his great mantra, Nama Samanda Vajranam Chanda Maharoshana Spataya Hung Traka Hung Mang. I dedicate myself to the universal diamond. May this raging fury be destroyed. And he will protect those who love woods and rivers, gods and animals, hobos and madmen, prisoners and sick people, musicians, playful women, hopeful children. And if anyone is threatened by advertising, air pollution, or the police, they should chant Smokey the Bear's war spell. Drown their butts, crush their butts, drown their butts, crush their butts. And Smokey the Bear will surely appear to put the enemy out with his Vajra shovel. Now, those who practice this sutra and then try to put it in practice will accumulate merit as countless as the sands of Arizona and Nevada. We'll help save planet Earth from total oil slick. We'll enter the age of harmony of man and nature. We'll win the tender love and caresses of men, women, and beasts. We'll always have ripe blackberries to eat and a sunny spot under a pine tree to sit at, and in the end will win highest, perfect enlightenment. What a story.
You know, it sounds a little biblical in the sense that it's a wonderful poem. It's one of my absolute favorites, but in the sense of the meek shall inherit the earth.
Well, it just happens to be Buddhist. There must be some spiritual truths out there, shared east and west.
I would hope so.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. It brings me back. You know, it's like, well, where is Smokey now when we need him? But a lot of it is our responsibility.
Well, Smokey is out there standing around in the smoke of the big fires, like that image that maybe came up on your screen, with his hands in gashos of gratitude, surrounded by flames, appreciating the destruction and the suffering that a big fire might carry, but also knowing that it must happen sometimes. That's part of the nature of the universe. There it is. Yeah. Smokey the Bear Bodhisattva, a painting from a woman in the Bay Area who was touched by this sutra. Yeah. And some of the people that work on the fire lines in the Forest Service, the younger people, they get in touch with me. They say, we love that. So it's out there.
Towards the end of your latest book, Back on the Fire, you mention about the world's problems today. You mention rising population and dwindling resources, and of course we hear it and see it. And you leave us with some possible remedies. I don't know if you remember that part.
More women in politics.
More women in politics.
That's the one people ask me about most.
Right.
Well, why did you say that? Come on. I say, think about it.
Yeah. Well, maybe, but wouldn't hurt to elaborate a little bit on that.
Without any unnecessary and untrendy essentialism, I do think that women bring a different perspective to economies and to politics, that they have a slightly different approach to the possibilities of sustainability. I think they're less hysterical and less excitable, and
Less reactive.
less reactive, and also they can be very tough, and that they're able to speak back to some men who need to be spoken back to, and it is in any case a matter of some justice. I would also like to see other creatures given a vote, but that's a ways off yet.
Right. Yeah, I think it was to sort of, as you were saying earlier, to preserve biodiversity as much as possible, and I think
we just take that as a moral imperative. We can't always be perfect with it, but it's just one of the things we agree to do the best we can with. Yeah, not sacrifice things. Not write them off as a sacrifice.
And you talk about biodiversity in terms of what is non-human as well as what is human, but you really want to bring in the natural world. But one of the things I see with biodiversity is that we need to preserve cultures and languages.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not biodiversity. That's cultural. But we have endangered languages. We have endangered small ethnic groups with unique skills and knowledge and stories. We have endangered stories, which are the folklore and songs of these smaller groups. Arctic people, for example, Inuit, Inupiaq, Yupik, Eskimo people, they have told me, I've been to Alaska a number of times, that since they got lifetime satellite television up there, they've quit telling stories. That they're losing their stories simply because they all go home and watch television in their little, not igloos, but nice little wooden houses. And they said before the television, even just, a few years before the television, when evening came, we'd go over to one of the elders' houses and the kids would love it. And there would be a storytelling time. That's being lost. They would also do homework because they're all going to school too. And languages, now that's one that is specific to my own background and interests. We lose a language, there's languages dropping off like dead flies off the planet right now. Tillamook is a language that has no speakers. Nishinin, the language that was spoken right here, no longer has any speakers. We've lost something every time we lose a language.
And what do we lose?
Amazingly, every language has its own surprising strategies for representing, dealing with, organizing the world. And some of them you wouldn't even guess at. There are Native American languages that have not only time tenses for verbs, happened in the past, it'll happen in the future. They have space tenses. It happened nearby, it happened a middle distance away, it happened far away out of sight in the grammar. There's so many things like that.
So there's actually something we can learn from it.
I think so, yeah. And I always recommend Edward Sapire's small, precise book called Language, which is mostly about North American languages, to give you a sense of how unexpected and different the strategies in the world's different languages are.
So as we look at the world in present day turmoil, with ethnic groups fighting one another and empires being expanded and contracted, there's something to be gained by respecting differences. And there's a lot to be gained by respecting differences and learning about differences and understanding one another better.
Undoubtedly that's true. There are dangers that come with, in recent centuries, the tendency of different small groups to get on each other's case and to have arguments and to have small wars. More recently, we've had the evolution of empires and larger nation states that have big wars. So we have to thread our way through this somehow. And even as, an interesting kind of model is actually Europe and Asia, where you do have large nations and nation states, but go into them and you see there are villages and communities that each have their own sense of pride and identity and are, in a certain sense, keeping culture going and keeping knowledge of the given region going, like the different regions of Bavaria or different parts of China, different agriculture, different dialects, different raincoats, and different folk songs. I would not want to say all of this will disappear pretty soon as we have a kind of grand universal new civilization that will make all of those little varieties of things unnecessary. People were saying that 25, 30 years ago even. Right. Now we appreciate microbrew beer, you know, and artisan cheese. So it is going a little bit the other direction.
Well, I want to thank you. The hour has passed very quickly, and I'm sure we could talk on and on.
Hey, I'm just getting started.
I want to thank the ROP crew once again for doing a great job today, and Gil Dominguez, the instructor. Hope you've enjoyed the program, and please, after this, turn off your television set, go outside, and have some fun, tell some stories. Thanks a lot.
Check out the phase of the moon.
The Nevada Irrigation District.
Are we supposed to be quiet right now?
Since 1921, providing clean and healthy drinking and irrigation water to more than 24,000 homes, farms, schools, and businesses in Nevada and Placer counties.